Montana Territory, July 1879, the woman was handed over like a sack of oats, no words, no kindness, just the clink of a coin pouch and a nod toward the ranch house. Tessa Thorne stood motionless in the dirt yard, wrists still marked from the rope that had bound her during the 2-day ride from Miles City. Her pale blue dress was torn at the shoulder, and her shoes, once proper, were caked in dust. She didn't speak. She hadn't since her father lost too much at the poker table and offered her to the rancher as collateral. The man who took her, Cyrus Langley, owned more land than conscience. He had 3 sons and a house full of silence. He looked her over like a mule, then turned to her father. "You got 1 month to come up with what you owe, else she stays." Her father nodded, shame in his eyes, then mounted his horse and rode away without a word to her. Tessa watched him go, shoulders squared even as her chin trembled, but she didn't cry. She hadn't cried since the day her mama died in childbirth, 5 years back. She had been 17 then, 18 now, and she'd learned since that tears never bought mercy. Inside the Langley ranch house, she was told to keep to the attic. She cleaned, cooked, and said nothing. Cyrus didn't touch her, but his eyes did. His sons were worse, always watching, always circling. It was the 3rd week when the cowboy came. His name was Boone Hartley, and he rode in for a job branding calves. He was tall, lean, with a quiet step and eyes that missed nothing. His shirt was worn but clean, and his voice was steady when he spoke. "Name's Boone. Heard you needed help with the branding." Cyrus looked him over. "Pays low, works hard." "I ain't scared of either." Boone took the job and slept in the hayloft. He worked from dawn until dark without complaint. He barely spoke to anyone except for Tessa. He noticed her the 2nd day when she brought cold biscuits to the men branding near the south fence. She kept her head down, but Boone saw the bruises on her wrist, the way her shoulders curled in like she was trying to disappear. That night, Boone waited until the others were asleep before he approached her on the porch. "You his daughter?" he asked softly. Tessa didn't answer at first. She just stared out at the moonlight. Then, "No, I was handed to him." Boone's brow tightened. "Handed, collateral." Her voice cracked only slightly. "My father owed him money." Boone's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice low. "You got any say in that?" She shook her head. "I am not sure that matters now." He sat beside her, but not too close. He didn't ask more, just sat with her. Days passed. He kept watching. He saw how the youngest Langley boy pulled at her braid when she passed, how Cyrus hovered near when she bent to scrub the floor. Boone's fists curled, but he waited. Then one night he heard Cyrus's boots on the stairs to the attic. Boone moved fast. He met Cyrus at the top of the stairs, blocking the way. "She is not yours to touch." Cyrus's face darkened. "She is mine until her daddy pays." Boone's hand hovered near his belt. "Then how much?" Cyrus laughed. "You planning to pay a man's gambling debt? That fool owed me near $100. Boone didn't flinch. "I will have it by first light." Cyrus narrowed his eyes. "You serious?" "Dead serious." Cyrus spat on the floor. "Fine, you bring the money, you can take her, but if you come short I will shoot you where you stand." Boone turned without another word. At dawn he rode to Miles City, sold his horse and saddle, the silver spurs from his boots, and the pocket watch his mother gave him when he turned 18. He came back with a canvas bag full of coins. Cyrus counted twice. "You are a fool, cowboy." Boone didn't respond. He just turned to where Tessa stood by the porch, her hands tight around her waist. "Come on," he said gently. "You are going somewhere safe." Tessa didn't move for a moment. Then she stepped down barefoot and walked to him. They rode double on a borrowed mule until they were 2 counties south, past the Judith River. Boone found a small line cabin he had helped build years ago, empty now, but solid. That night, she sat on the porch wrapped in a wool blanket, watching the stars. Boone sat beside her, arms resting on his knees. "You should not have done that," she said quietly. "I know. You gave everything?" "I did." She looked at him, really looked. "Why?" Boone met her eyes. "Because no one ever did for my ma. And because I could not ride away knowing what he might have done to you." Tessa blinked hard. "I do not know what to do now." "You do not have to know." His voice was low, steady. "You are safe here, as long as you want to be." She didn't answer. But after a long silence, she leaned against his shoulder. Boone did not move, did not speak. He just let her rest there, and the stars kept turning overhead. The wind changed in early August, tugging cooler air down from the mountains and bending the tall grasses around the cabin. Boone had fixed the roof that week, replacing 2 warped shingles with cedar shakes salvaged from the old corral. Tessa watched him from the doorway, a bowl of peeled apples in her lap, the scent of wood smoke drifting from the chimney behind her. She had begun to move differently, no longer coiled, no longer braced. She spoke more, too, but only when it mattered. Boone never pressed. He worked and waited, and the silence between them shaped itself into something not hollow but steady. That morning she stepped over the threshold barefoot, her hem brushing the porch planks. "Do you know how to build a root cellar?" she asked. Boone straightened from where he'd been splitting kindling. "Depends how deep you want it. We'll need it deep if we're to keep anything past first frost." He set the axe aside. "I can show you how to brace the walls. Wood's no good on its own, not once the ground gets wet. I can help dig." Boone nodded, then gestured toward the far end of the clearing. "Ground's soft near the cottonwoods. We'll start there." They worked until dusk, hands blistered, boots thick with clay. Boone showed her how to measure by stride, how to gauge depth with a string and peg. She didn't ask questions unless she meant to remember the answers. That night, they ate boiled beans and wild onions by lamplight. Boone watched her across the table, the light catching the fine line of her jaw as she chewed, slow and thoughtful. He cleared his throat once. "You ever lived through a winter this far north?" She shook her head. "Miles City was the coldest I'd known." "But I've read of worse." He leaned back in his chair. "It cuts deep out here, snow's dry and mean. I'll need to trap more before November." Her eyes lifted to his. "I can sew pelts." Boone studied her a moment. "Did you learn that from your mother?" "No," she said. "From the woman who mended for the army post. I'd bring her buttons she dropped, just to have an excuse to watch. She let me stitch on scraps. I got some beaver hides need cleaning. I'll need a bone needle." Boone nodded once, then stood to fetch the pouch where he kept such things. He returned, set it gently before her on the table. She brushed her fingers over the carved tip of the needle, then looked up. "You don't ask much." He met her gaze. "You don't offer more than you want to give." The lantern crackled, its flame hissing against the glass. Tessa set the needle down. "I used to think silence meant danger. Now I think maybe it just means space." "I reckon it can mean both," Boone said. "Depends who you're sharing it with." She folded her hands in her lap. "I never expected to meet someone who listens more than he talks. You've had your fill of the other kind." Her mouth tugged, not quite a smile. "More than enough." Boone stood, walked to the hearth, and stirred the fire. "I'm heading to the river come morning. There's otter signs near the bend. Might bring back something worth drying." She shifted in her chair. "Then I'll start working on the meat hooks. You'll need a place to hang what you catch." He turned, and for a breath their eyes held. "You're good at building things," Boone said. "I never had the chance to try before." Now he smiled. "You're taking to it like you were born for it." She didn't look away. "Maybe I was." Outside, a loon called from the water. The night pressed close, but the cabin stayed warm. Neither of them said more, but when Boone banked the fire and she stood to tie back the curtain that separated her cot from the rest of the room, he paused with his hand on the lamp. "You sleep easy now." She hesitated, then gave a small nod. "I do." He lowered the flame to a glow. "Good." The light softened, and in that hush, the air between them felt less like distance and more like something waiting to be crossed, but not yet. Not tonight. They slept, each in their place, the whisper of wind outside no longer a threat, but a rhythm. The kind that settles into bone and says, "Stay." By late September, the chokecherries had turned black on the stem, and the aspens had begun their slow burn into gold. Boone stood beside the cabin's side wall, sharpening the steel blade of a drawknife against a whetstone, his motions steady, deliberate. Tessa knelt nearby, sorting the last of the dried herbs she'd foraged from the southern ridge yarrow for fever, wild mint for stomach sickness, and a handful of juniper berries she was unsure how to use but had gathered anyway. She didn't ask him what he planned to carve. She had learned Boone didn't explain much unless asked directly. Still, she glanced up from time to time, her fingers pausing on the stems. You ever make something just to look at? She asked, brushing dust from her skirt. Boone didn't look up. Not usually. Most things I make got to hold weight. I never had the time for things that weren't useful, she said. But I think I'd like to, just once. Boone tested the blade's edge with his thumb. What would you make? She considered it. A whistle out of birch, not for calling anyone. Just to hear a sound I made myself. He looked at her now, something unreadable in his expression. That's a good reason. She lowered her eyes again, cheeks warming. Later, while the sun dropped past the pines, Boone brought in the piece of wood he'd been carving. He set it on the table beside the tin lantern and stepped back. It was a small horse, no taller than a hand, made from pine smoothed to a shine with oil. The legs were thick enough it wouldn't break, and the mane had been carved in thin, careful grooves. Tessa stared at it, then reached out slowly. You made this for me. I did. She turned it over in her palm, thumb brushing the curve of the neck. Why a horse? You've been penned up too long. Figured you ought to have something that runs free. She didn't answer, but her eyes stayed on the carving for a long time. That night, frost crept over the ground like a slow breath. Boone added a second log to the fire while Tessa laid a quilt over her cot, her motions practiced and calm. She had taken to sleeping with her boots beside her bed, not from fear but habit. Boone leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, watching the coals settle. I'll ride to town in 3 days, he said. Dry goods and salt. You need anything? She folded the edge of the quilt. Thread. I used up most of what you had stitching the pelts. He nodded. Anything else? She hesitated. Paper, just a few sheets. Boone's brow lifted. You write? I used to, not letters, just thoughts. I'd like to remember this place in case I forget later. He didn't speak for a moment. Then I'll bring back a book of blank pages. She looked over. You don't have to, I want to. They stood that way for a while, the quiet between them turning soft. When Boone left 3 days later, she watched him from the edge of the woods, her shawl drawn close. He didn't take a rifle, only his knife and a coin pouch stitched into the lining of his coat. He turned once at the bend in the trail. She raised a hand, and he touched the brim of his hat before disappearing into the trees. Tessa spent the day gathering wood, then boiling the last of the potatoes before they turned. She lined the cellar shelves with straw and swept the corners of the cabin, though there was little dust to chase. At dusk, she sat by the hearth and carved a whistle from a scrap of birch Boone had left behind. It took her 5 tries to get it to sound, and when it finally did thin and sharp, like a hawk's cry, she smiled. Boone returned the next evening, saddle bags heavy. He handed her a parcel wrapped in calico. Inside, she found a bound book of blank parchment, the cover made of pressed cloth dyed a deep green. She ran her fingers over it. It's too fine for me. No such thing, he said. She opened to the first page. I don't know what I'll write. Start with what you see, he said. That's how I remember things, one piece at a time. She nodded, then looked up. You're different than I expected. Boone leaned against the table, arms folded. How so? I thought men like you only looked out for themselves. He met her gaze. I used to. She waited. Until I saw what happened when folks didn't look out for each other. Tessa stood, her hands still holding the book. You don't ask me to be grateful. That's not why I did it. I know. The fire crackled behind them, and the cabin held the weight of something unspoken but not heavy. Tessa stepped closer. You didn't just give me a place to be safe. Boone's voice was quiet. What else did I give you? She looked up at him, steady. Room to become who I am. He didn't answer with words. He just reached out, slow and sure, and let his hand rest over hers where it held the book. She didn't pull away. By early October, the valley held stillness between breaths. The river ran slower, its banks crusted with frost by sunrise, and mule deer had begun bedding near the cottonwoods, leaving prints through the thinning grass. Boone returned one morning with a hair strung from his belt and a split in his palm from a dry branch that had snapped wrong. Tessa washed the wound in boiled water and wrapped it in strips torn from the petticoat she no longer wore. You ought to let it rest a day, she said, binding the cloth snug. He flexed his fingers, then stilled. Won't keep me from setting traps. You're not the only one who can check them. He watched her fold the edge of the bandage. You mean to run lines alone? I mean to help carry the weight. Boone didn't argue, he simply nodded once. That afternoon, she took the older pair of snow-worn boots from the storage trunk, stuffed the toes with rags, and followed the trap line west of the ridge. She returned with 2 weasels and a satchel of dried moss for the cabin floor. Boone didn't say anything when she laid them beside the skinning board. But that night, he added another log to the fire without her asking, and the warmth stretched farther into the corners. They began sleeping on opposite sides of the hearth, close enough to speak between the dark but not touching. Tessa kept her coat rolled beneath her head, Boone used his saddle blanket. Their talks came in pieces about which trees dropped their leaves first, or how to tell a mink from a muskrat by the shape of the paw small things, but steady. One evening, as the fire settled low, Tessa traced her finger along the edge of the birch whistle she'd carved. Boone lay with one arm behind his head, eyes half-lidded. "Did you always plan to stay lone?" she asked. He didn't shift, didn't plan much of anything. "I wonder what you would have been if you had." He looked over. "Not sure a man like me gets to choose." "You did," she said quietly. "When you brought me here," he sat up, elbows on his knees. "That didn't feel like a choice. Felt like the only thing I could do and still look myself in the eye. You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked. Boone ran a hand over his jaw. "Sometimes." "Then I remember what I rode from." Tessa turned the whistle in her hand. "You think we could make it through a winter here? If we keep our heads and plan right, we stand a chance." She was quiet a moment. "I want to learn how to track game by sign alone, not just traps." "I want to know what to listen for." Boone nodded. "We'll start tomorrow, before sunup, and after that?" she asked. He met her eyes across the fire. "After that, we keep on." She didn't look away. Together, the paws stretched, but not from uncertainty. "If you want that," he said, voice low, "I do." Boone stood, walked around the hearth, and knelt beside her bedroll. He didn't reach for her, only rested his hand beside hers on the blanket. "I won't ever take more than you offer," he said. "Not once." She turned her palm into his. "I'm offering this." They stayed like that as the fire dropped to coals, their fingers woven together, quiet wrapped around them like wool. Outside, the frost thickened, but inside, the warmth held. The first snow fell in the middle of November, fine and dry, drifting slow over the ridge and softening the lines of the land. Boone had seen it coming in the way the deer moved lower before dusk, their steps quickened, their flanks sharp with hunger. He came in from the lean-to with his coat damp at the shoulders, and Tessa handed him a towel she'd stitched from flour sack cotton. "It's holding steady," he said, brushing snow from his hair. "We'll be snowed in by next week," she nodded. "I've packed the cellar tight." "We'll have enough to last." He looked at her then, not with worry but something steadier. "I never planned to ride out before spring." Tessa didn't answer right away. She hung the kettle on its iron hook and stirred the embers until the water began to hiss. Then she said, "Neither did I." The days folded into one another after that, quiet and full with motion. She learned the way snow changed sound, how it blanketed the forest so footsteps disappeared, how even the birds quieted beneath its hush. Boone taught her to read the shadows of tracks across the crust, to spot where a rabbit had paused too long in the open. One afternoon, they found a fox snared near the river bend. Its leg was twisted but not broken. Boone knelt beside it, hands calm, and Tessa watched the way he spoke low, not to her, but to the animal. "You could have left it," she said gently. Once the fox had limped off with its paw wrapped in a strip of cloth, Boone stood, brushing snow from his knees. "I've left too many things behind already." They didn't speak after that for a while, just walked back through the trees, the sky paling into dusk. That night, she hemmed the last of the muslin scraps into a curtain for the window above her cot. Boone sat nearby, mending a harness strap with slow, practiced stitches. "After spring," she said, not looking up, "what would you do different if you could?" Boone considered. "I'd build a corral, maybe keep a milk cow if we can barter for one." She tied off her thread. "I'd like to plant something, not just gather but grow." "We could fence a patch," he said, "so long as the soil's not too rocky." She folded the cloth in her lap. "You think the land would let us stay?" Boone met her eyes. "It already has." They left it there, but something shifted. Not in words, in the way she let her hand rest against his when she passed him the next morning, in the way he reached to tuck a curl behind her ear without asking. By December, the snow lay deep enough that they cleared a path from the door to the woodshed with shovels Boone had carved from pine slabs. The fire never went cold, and the cabin held the scent of smoke and dried herbs. One evening, as wind pressed against the walls, Tessa set down her pen and closed the green-bound journal Boone had given her. She turned toward him where he sat by the hearth, shaping a new handle for the kettle. "I used to think quiet meant no one cared," she said. Boone glanced up, setting his whittling aside. "And now I think it's where care lives." He stood, crossed the room, and knelt in front of her. "You've changed, so have you." He reached for her hand. "There's something I want to ask." She waited. "I want to build a life with you. Not just get through winter. I want spring and every season after with you beside me." Tessa didn't speak for a long moment. Then she rose, pulling him with her, and kissed him with the steadiness of someone who had waited her whole life to be seen. "I want that too," she said. "This place, this work, this love, all of it." They married at the edge of winter with only the trees to witness. Boone carved 2 rings from elk bone, and Tessa wore hers on a leather cord around her neck. No preacher, no paper, just a promise spoken by the fire under a sky heavy with snow. By early March, the river began to move again, slow and sure. Tessa planted spinach in a wooden box by the window. Boone saddled a new gelding traded from a trapper and rode south for seed and iron nails. When he returned, he brought a hand-held bell for the cabin porch and a second quilt stitched from red flannel, years past. They built a second room onto the cabin, then a lean-to for firewood, then a fenced garden where Tessa grew carrots and beans. Boone taught local boys to track and mend traps. Tessa delivered babies for women too far from town to ride. They grew older with the land, the way trees do, rings deepening, roots spreading wide. On warm nights, they sat side by side on the porch, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, hearts beating quiet and whole, and they were never alone again.